The period from the 1860s to the turn of the century was a transformative era for the American Southwest. Across what are now Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California, western Texas, Utah, and Nevada, the landscape was mostly arid or semi-arid. Summers were scorching, winters could bring snow to higher elevations, and water was the most precious resource. Yet these lands were vibrant, full of life, and home to deeply rooted indigenous cultures and new settlers alike. Indigenous communities, including the Tohono O'odham, Apache, Navajo, and Hopi, had long mastered survival in this arid land. They knew where seasonal waterholes would appear, which plants could be eaten or used for medicine, and how to build homes that stayed cool in blazing heat. The towering saguaro cactus of the Sonoran Desert was more than a symbol. It was a source of fruit, tools, and guidance across the landscape. In the 1860s, new settlers began arriving in larger numbers, driven by land opportunities, mining, and the promise of cattle ranching. The arrival of Americans after the Civil War brought profound changes to the region. Towns expanded, trade routes became busier, and the blending of indigenous, Mexican, and Anglo cultures began to shape a unique Southwestern identity.
Water dictated settlement patterns. Farmers relied on rivers like the Rio Grande, Gila River, and smaller seasonal streams to irrigate crops. Communities built canals and ditches, sometimes reviving or improving on systems that had been used for centuries by indigenous and Spanish farmers. Crops like corn, beans, squash, and wheat were staples, while orchards, cotton, and vineyards were attempted where irrigation permitted. Ranching became a cornerstone of the Southwest economy. Cattle roamed across hundreds of miles of open range. Cowboys, heavily influenced by Mexican vaqueros, guided herds with skill, knowledge of the terrain, and a mastery of roping and horsemanship. Life on the trail was demanding. Dust storms, flash floods, and rustlers were constant threats, but it forged a culture of independence, resilience, and adaptability that would define the frontier. Mining boomed across the region as well. Silver, gold, and copper discoveries brought waves of prospectors, and towns like Tombstone and Bisbee appeared almost overnight. Boom towns were vibrant, chaotic places filled with saloons, shops, and miners' boarding houses. Life was precarious. When mines played out, towns sometimes emptied just as quickly as they had filled. Transportation was difficult. Before railroads reached much of the Southwest, stagecoaches like those on the Butterfield Overland Mail carried mail, supplies, and passengers across deserts, mountains, and river valleys. Journeys could take days or weeks depending on weather and terrain. Trails were rough, and travelers faced the constant hazards of heat, sandstorms, and treacherous terrain.
By the late 1800s, nothing reshaped the arid Southwest more dramatically than the arrival of the railroad. Before its expansion, life across Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and surrounding regions was defined by isolation. Travel was slow, trade was limited, and communities depended heavily on local resources and seasonal cycles. Stagecoaches and freight wagons had long connected distant towns, but journeys were difficult and often dangerous. Crossing arid land meant dealing with extreme heat, scarce water, and unpredictable terrain. A trip that might take days today could take weeks, and supplies were never guaranteed to arrive on time. The railroad changed everything. One of the most influential lines in the Southwest was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, which pushed westward in the late 19th century. By the 1880s, its tracks stretched across New Mexico and Arizona, linking the region to national markets and major cities. At the same time, the Southern Pacific Railroad expanded eastward from California, creating vital connections across the desert. For the first time, goods could move quickly and reliably across the Southwest. Cattle raised on open ranges could be shipped to markets in the east. Minerals extracted from mines in places like Bisbee could reach factories and refineries. Farmers could send crops beyond their immediate region, and supplies, from tools to clothing, could arrive in days instead of months. Railroads didn't just connect towns, they created them. New settlements sprang up along the tracks, often where water sources made steam locomotives possible. Existing towns like Tucson grew rapidly as they became key rail hubs. Others rose quickly and disappeared just as fast, depending on whether the railroad stopped there or bypassed them entirely. Water remained a constant concern. Steam locomotives required massive amounts of it, so railroads built water towers and pumping stations across the desert. These stops became lifelines not only for trains, but also for nearby communities. The railroad also transformed daily life. Mail arrived faster. Newspapers connected remote towns to national events. Travel, once dangerous and slow, became more predictable. People could move west more easily, bringing new cultures, businesses, and ideas into the Southwest. But the expansion of railroads also accelerated change and conflict. Indigenous lands were crossed and divided by tracks, and traditional ways of life were disrupted. The same rails that brought opportunity also brought displacement and transformation on a massive scale.
Towns like Tucson, Santa Fe, and Salt Lake City became hubs of commerce and culture. They combined the influence of indigenous traditions, Spanish heritage, and Anglo settlers. Adobe buildings, shaded courtyards, and narrow streets reflected centuries of architectural adaptation to the climate. Local cuisine, festivals, and social life demonstrated a blending of cultures that was unique to the Southwest. Despite hardships, life continued. Desert plants, wildlife, and the rhythms of the seasons dictated survival. People learned to rise before the heat, build with thick walls to hold cool air, and store water carefully. Families, traders, and communities thrived, proving that these arid lands, though challenging, were far from empty or lifeless. By the end of the 19th century, the Southwest had been transformed. Indigenous communities still lived according to traditions and seasonal cycles. Settlers had established farms, ranches, and towns. Mines had brought wealth and population, and the stagecoach trails had set the stage for the coming railroads. The arid lands had become a space where cultures met, adapted, and created a distinctive frontier identity, one that would inspire stories, legends, and eventually the imagery of the Wild West.
In the next episode, we are going to talk about how the desert Southwest influenced the entertainment industry through Western films, the difference between the myths of the Wild West and what really happened, as well as talk about famous Western actors who worked in this arid land. That's it for this episode of The Arid Frontier.